I'm going to introduce you to SpeedGrade. And since we're going to work with SpeedGrade for the rest of the course, I suggest that you make it readily accessible. I have the SpeedGrade icon here on my desktop. I suggest you do the same or put it on your dock or inside your task panel. Let's start up SpeedGrade. Now we're going to start a new project in just a second, but let me explain one thing really quickly here. We're going to start a new SpeedGrade IRCP. IRCP is kind of a loose translation of Iridas Composition Format. Iridas is the company that created SpeedGrade. It's been around since about 2000. Adobe purchased the SpeedGrade technology in the fall of 2011 and has been upgrading it ever since. So let's create a new project by clicking on this new SpeedGrade IRCP. And that opens up SpeedGrade in this view. The workspace here will look different than the workspace you're going to see when you open up a Premiere Pro project inside SpeedGrade. The differences, though, are not critical, but I do want to show you the difference between opening up SpeedGrade as a standalone product or opening up SpeedGrade with a Premiere Pro project inside it. What largely prompted this course on color correction was the fact that SpeedGrade now works hand in hand with Premiere Pro and vice versa. It's a very important development that happened late in 2013. And looking at this media panel here is a clue as to why it's so important. SpeedGrade has always been a high-level production tool. You would find it typically only inside professional, controlled video production environments, where they would have calibrated monitors and scopes to handle things like waveform, RGB parade, vector scopes, and histograms. They would not rely on the software scopes, rather they would rely on hardware scopes. And as part of that whole production workflow, they would not work with typical HD video file formats. They would generally work only with image sequences, most typically DPX. And DPX image sequences use one image file per frame of video, and these tend to be very, very large files. So SpeedGrade works primarily with image sequences, but it also works with some raw formats, like ARIA Alexa and Redcode raw R3D files, and also Phantom HD, which typically used for high frame rate recording, but not with typical HD file formats like AVC HD, or AVC Intra, or DVC Pro HD, or XDCAM HD. So for most typical professional and prosumer videographers, SpeedGrade just was not something that they could use. Now you can. Now you can take any kind of a video file that works inside Premiere Pro and open up a Premiere Pro project with those video files in it inside SpeedGrade. It is a huge development. But in the meantime, I want to show you what happens if you open up SpeedGrade as a standalone product without a Premiere Pro project in it. Now I'm going to get into the Premiere Pro project workflow later. So here we are looking at the Assets folder from our Working Files folder, and you see a bunch of black screens there, because MP4 files, the type of files we've been working with, will not open up inside SpeedGrade. But QuickTime MOV files will open up inside SpeedGrade. And in Windows, you can open up Windows AVI files. And those are the only video file types that you can open up inside SpeedGrade. So to continue this tour, I'd like you to open up a SpeedGrade project. So to do that, go up to this little icon here, this one that says Open Up SpeedGrade or Premiere Pro Project, and click on that. Go to Working Files, SpeedGrade Projects, and click on Workspace IRCP, and then click Open. And here are 3 clips. These are the 3 clips that are available here inside the Assets folder. The Harbor movie, the Coast movie, and I'll scroll on down here a little bit, and this little Vineyard movie here. Those 3 are on the timeline, which we could have easily added to the timeline, but it's hovering over there and clicking on the plus button. So once they're on the timeline like this, your next step is to switch over to the Color tab. Now switching to the Color tab also opens up the analysis tools. Here we have 4 scopes, 3 of which you've seen inside Premiere Pro. We've got the Waveform Monitor, RGB Parade, and the Vector Scope. Here we also have the histogram, which can come in handy when you're trying to do some color balancing. Now when you're working with a Premiere Pro project inside SpeedGrade, the Media tab will be grayed out, the Result tab will be grayed out, and the Render tab will be visible but will be essentially useless. If you click on it, you won't see all this stuff. Instead, you'll see a message that says, go render your project inside Premiere Pro. So the only tab that you'll be working with inside Premiere Pro is Color, which is okay because that's the only one you need. I want to show you some other characteristics. Down here in the timeline, you've got a playhead that you can just drag left and right here by clicking on that rectangle or clicking on this little guy up there. There are options here to view the timeline or not, and also hear the timeline or not. Those won't be available inside the Premiere Pro project. You can only see it, you can't hear it. Down here in the bottom are some more tabs that are relative to what you have here in the timeline. You start off with the Timeline tab that'll let you adjust certain characteristics of the timeline. Well, that won't be there inside a Premiere Pro project. You have a Clip tab there. That too won't be available inside a Premiere Pro project. You can't edit clips from a Premiere Pro project here inside SpeedGrade. You're not going to change their size or their position. You're just going to work on color, which means only the Look tab will be available inside the Premiere Pro project version of things. Stereo 3D, audio, and pan and scan are grayed out now because we're not working on those particular characteristics in this project. Those can be made available if we work on those kinds of things here inside SpeedGrade, but those can never be available when you're working with a Premiere Pro project. The Look tab is where you do all your work. On the left-hand side here, you have layers. It works kind of like adjustment layers inside Premiere Pro, where every single layer above the one on the bottom there can have some effects on it or some changes to it or a mask or what have you. So even though you have a single clip here when you're working on a Premiere Pro project or here inside SpeedGrade as a standalone product, you can add layers to it within the clip. You can add more primary layers where you're doing primary color correction, where you're correcting the entire clip. You can add a secondary layer like this, which looks very much like the secondary controls inside the 3-way color corrector and the RGB color corrector, where you're selecting an area based on hue, lightness, and saturation. And you can also add lookup tables and effects by clicking this over here, selecting from the various effects, or adding a lookup table here as well. I'll get rid of the secondary layer by clicking this little garbage can. Here's where you do your color grading. It looks sort of like the 3-way color corrector, where you can have a master control called overall here, and then work inside the shadows, midtones, and highlights. The color wheels here, though, behave differently than the color wheels inside the 3-way color corrector. This is more like RGB curves. When you hover over one of these color wheels, it lights up saying, okay, you can work on me now. And if you pull toward a particular color, like this, you're not only changing the color, but you're also changing the luma. And here you can change the luma separately by dragging this left or right like that. And you can do that for the shadows, midtones, and highlights here in the overall look. Also within the shadows, midtones, and highlights, you can work with the lower end of the shadows, the middle end of the shadows, the high end of the shadows. Down below here are looks. If I click on this button there, that shows all the looks. These looks will look familiar. Scrolling down here a ways, you can see the grouping of them. Slide this over a bit. Just like in Premiere Pro, you've got the cinematic, desaturation, and style and temperature. These are the lumetri looks we saw inside Premiere Pro. When you add one of these here, you have more options in terms of how you can control it. You also have 2 more kinds of looks called speed looks. They're provided by a third party. This is where you can make your clips look like they're all shot by the same kind of a camera, even though they were shot by different cameras. And then once you do that, then you can apply some cinematic looks on top of that. I'll close this down here. And on the right-hand side, there's another panel with 3 characteristics: snapshots, masks, and annotations. Annotations won't be available when you're working on Premiere Pro projects, but the mask option will be. A mask is a lot like a track matte key inside Premiere Pro, but it's much easier to work with here. For example, we can add vignettes very simply by just clicking on this. That adds a vignette. Over here, I click on this, and that connects it to the clip like that. And then I can change, let's say, the overall brightness, make that darker, reset the color over here to have that red go away so you don't get confused. And that adds a vignette like that. I can turn the vignette on or off like that. Very easy to add a vignette and other kinds of masks as well. So that's a basic rundown on the SpeedGrade workspace. Just keep in mind that when we open up a Premiere Pro project inside SpeedGrade, there will be fewer options. But the fact that there are fewer options is really not an issue at all, because the options that we're going to be missing are things that we can do back inside Premiere Pro.